Can your shutter speed ruin a photo? I know art is subjective, but in some cases, yes. And then in other cases, no, not at all. And where I would put the definition in that is when you're talking about long exposures. It's personal preference. But if you were shooting sports, wildlife, the wrong amount of blur can potentially ruin a photo. So it all depends on the application that you need it for. But still in all, in some cases, it is personal preference. And where I make the definition of that is long exposures. Some people love it, some people hate it. So when you're going for waterfalls, rivers, streams, cascading water, this is where I find the biggest debates going on. Some people hate long exposures for these. Some people love really, really long exposures. And then there's people like myself who are right in the middle, don't want it too short, don't want it too long. Just, I want to have, like me personally, I want to have some texture left in it. So there are people out there and they want to see exactly how the eye sees it. So they're going to be shooting at 1/50th of a second. They may shoot even faster, 1/250th of a second. Not entirely sure what they shoot. I don't overly like it myself, like I said. Then there's the other side of the camp where they want 1 second, 2 second, even up to 4 second exposures. It really depends on the scene. It can look like marshmallows and I'm not a big fan of that. But sometimes it can be absolutely beautiful. And then there's the mid ground where I find that I sit the most. And it's not too fast and it's not too slow. And it's in and around a 1/4 second. So you're still getting a blur to the water, but you're getting texture. So you get these like zigzags in the water, and I love it. I have 2 examples of locations within Ireland where you need different shutter speeds to achieve similar outcomes in texture and movement. Powerscourt Waterfall, one of the tallest waterfalls in Ireland, featured in the Vikings TV show. It's about 110 meters tall. And when I shot it, I was shooting at possibly 1/30th of a second, if I remember correctly. It was pretty fast. Then if we go up to Northern Ireland, where parts of Game of Thrones was filmed, we go to Tullymore Forest Park. In along the stepping stones, you're talking about a 1/4 second when you're right beside the stepping stones. But if you move away and you have a wide angle lens, the perspective is actually very forgiving, and you could need to increase your shutter speed to 1 second or 2 seconds. And that's another thing that happens with your shutter speed when it comes to water flow, is depending how close you are. If you're right beside the water, you don't need as slow of a shutter speed. But if you're standing on the side of a cliff, you may actually need a longer exposure. That also brings me on to the next point as well. No matter what I tell you in this video, it is all about testing and seeing what you like at the time. There is no definitive answer to this. You could have full intentions to go to a location to shoot a 2-minute, 4-minute exposure, and you shoot that and you're like, that is absolutely unnecessary. I could have done this with 30 seconds. So what you do? Take off that ND filter and shoot 30 seconds. So it totally depends. And it's happened to me so many times. Don't get discouraged. Always make sure that you get to a location nice and early to combat this issue, because if you're running out of time and you want to shoot a long exposure, especially when you want to shoot a long exposure, that can ruin it. You may actually waste time trying to find what shutter speed and you lose the light. Now that we've spoken about the long exposures, let's talk about the shorter exposures, because there's so much more to actually consider. Because on the long exposures, you're always going to be on a tripod. For the shorter ones, you could be handheld, you could be videoing, and who knows what. So we'll talk about the handheld stuff first of all. So when you're hand holding, which is going to be so common to you, the common trend, and it relates to video as well, is using a 180 rule. So the 180 rule means basically it's double whatever you're using. So in video, it's double your frame rate. 25 frames a second, 1/50th of a second. Now, for handheld photography, for steady hands, steady shots, the ideal practice is whatever the focal length is, double it for your shutter speed. 50mm, 1/100th of a second. 100mm, 1/200th of a second. 600mm, 1/1200th of a second. See what I mean? It's double. That's the 180 rule. So you're here, flip it over, and you're double. You could be one of these very lucky people who have extremely steady hands. I unfortunately am not one of those people. So you could get away with shooting at 1/30th of a second, 1/15th of a second on like 50mm, but once you get over 50mm, I find that you should really be shooting at 1/100th of a second at least, because you are going to introduce, even with image stabilization on, or OSS, or however it's called with your camera's company, I tend to find that my go-to shutter speed when I'm at an event would be minimum 1/125th of a second. I try to get to 1/200th of a second, because what I found in the past is someone will make a movement and then you get this blur, and I don't overly want the blur, so the 1/200 of a second will still have a little bit of blur, but it'll be mitigated quite a bit. Now for events, that's also where having faster glass can be quite important, having f2.8 zoom lenses, or even having a prime lens at hand for those candid shots. And like all things in photography, it's a balancing act of compromise. So if you're at an event, your camera's not great at shooting high ISOs, your lens is only maxing at f4, then you're going to have to consider shooting at a slower shutter speed, because you need to have that cleaner image, and you can't actually get any more light into the lens because it maxes out at f4. What would benefit you greatly then in that scenario is introducing a speed light into the event, but you'd need to make sure ahead of time that it's okay with the event organizer. Some parts in events, like during speeches and stuff, they don't want you using speed lights, so you just have to shoot with natural lighting. So I usually hope beyond hope that there is someone doing some sort of follow spot, or some sort of light, main light is actually lighting the speaker on stage. Otherwise, you're just going to have noisy images if it is a case that your camera can't handle high ISO. Now, just to briefly explain how great speed lights and strobe lights can be for your photography, I won't go into great detail. There is a full video up here you can check out for that. There's a thing called flash duration with strobe lights and speed lights. The lower the power, the faster this flash duration. So your max shutter speed on any kind of camera, top end camera, is 1/8000 of a second, while most speed lights can achieve 1/12,000 of a second with the flash duration if you have their speed set low. So for example, I was photographing a wedding band, and I was up on stage and I was photographing the drummer, and I was at 1/50th of a second. But I had a speed light at, I think it was probably in around 1/16 power, 1/32 power, and his drumstick was frozen, no blur, bam! And it was all thanks to the speed light. All thanks to the speed light. So in some scenarios, if you can get away with it, speed lights, they're just, and then strobe lights as well. If you get the bigger strobe lights and you want to get, if you want to freeze water and stuff. But like I said before, I have a full video on that. Now we come to the Formula 1 side of things, which is just the super crazy shutter speeds. 1/2000 of a second, 1/4000 of a second, wildlife sports. And the one thing you have to consider with this is time of day. And you will be surprised. You're not going to be shooting birds at 12 during the day, so that's out of the question. You may get lucky with it. Maybe in winter in Ireland you might have some nice sun. But really and truly, if you look at any wildlife photographer, they're usually shooting around the better times of the day or on overcast days, which leads to the obvious. There's not as much light, so when you're shooting at 1/2000 of a second, you're going to have to up that ISO to combat the fact that you're not getting any light into the camera. If you're using like a big 600mm lens, it max opens at 6.3, so you don't have much coming in from the aperture. You've even less coming in from your shutter speed, so you need to be up at ISO 2000, ISO 3200. I've even heard of photographers going up to ISO 6400. It is not unheard of to do really, really high ISOs. To them, it's not overly high. This is the thing. When you talk to wildlife photographers, ISO 1600, ISO 3200 they're not considered high ISOs. This is just a fact of life. They need it to get the shutter speeds. There's not much else to be said when you're shooting the really fast shutter speeds. It's just, you're just going to have to make compromises, know your camera inside out to make sure that you know where you can shoot and where you need to be when it comes to the other settings to get everything right. Hope you liked the video. Hope you got something from it. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and ring the bell to get notified every time I post up a new video. And find me on all the social medias under Mark Duffy Photography. And until the next time, later gators.